Greetings, demon hosts, and welcome to Codex Compliant.
In the last episode, we talked about knights. This time, let's talk about knights who are grey. Well, silver, but you know what I mean. 2003's Codex Daemonhunters is, more or less, the first Grey Knights Codex. They just weren't ready to be a headline act yet. Now, the Grey Knights had been a thing in 40k for a long time, showing up way back in 1989 in Realm of Chaos Slaves to Darkness. They were a fairly standard marine chapter of beakies, as was the style at the time, who were permanently attached to the demon-hunting inquisitors of the Ordo Malleus. So intertwined with them in fact that the Grey Knights chapter master has always been an inquisitor rather than a marine.
These early Grey Knights had an interesting icon of an Imperial Aquila carrying an axe and a rod. Yes, it is a pain to paint, thank you for asking. Also, in this iteration, it's really only their librarians who were psychers, with the rest being emphatically not, which is almost the exact opposite of their current setup. How exactly you painted a Grey Knight of this era was a little vague unless you spied one on an heavy metal page in White Dwarf, and it wasn't super consistent, so I imagine there was many an interesting take on their scheme back in the day. As you just saw, Grey Knights did get some bespoke Terminator miniatures in 1st edition, and were still kicking around in 2nd. In fact, they were exclusively wearing Terminator armour by that point. They would show up again in White Dwarf's Index Astartes column in 2001 during 3rd edition, with a decidedly darker scheme than you'd expect. This was followed in 2003 with a grand return to the game, with a new miniature range and the subject of today's video.
Written by Andy Chambers, Phil Kelly and Graham McNeil, Codex Daemonhunters, with its Paul Dayton cover art so nice they used it twice, can be considered a companion piece to the Witch Hunters Codex released a little later, in that they're both books based around a particular flavour of the Inquisition that are accompanied by some stuff that didn't really fit anywhere else, but with the bulk of the list being made up of power-armoured folks from an already established faction. Although, gotta be honest, it does slightly bother us that one of these books has a space in its name and one doesn't. Anyway, onto the fluff. As a 3rd edition book, the total amount of hard and deep lore in here doesn't match up to what you'd see in a modern codex. But as a late 3rd edition codex, it's certainly got a lot more than the early ones. As such, we get info elaborating upon the Ordo Malleus, the section of the Inquisition in charge of demon hunting, that lays out the different ideologies at play. The first are the Puritans, who believe the only way to truly combat the forces of chaos is to become true defenders of the faith. The most extreme of which are the Mono-Dominants, who believe it is mankind's manifest destiny to rule the universe. And like anyone who casually throws terms like manifest destiny around, they attempt to achieve this by killing absolutely anyone who they perceive as an enemy, or even just mildly inconvenient. The radical side of the Ordo Malleus, on the other hand, seeks the destruction of chaos by turning its own power against it. Sometimes this is by using chaos-tainted artifacts, but can be as far as creating demon hosts. That is, demons trapped in a human host and bound to their master. The Grey Knights, similarly, got a few pages discussing them, and it's more or less the Cliff Notes version of their current backstory. Founded roughly around the 2nd founding, secretive to the extent that few even know of their existence, rumoured to be made from the Emperor's gene sperm, seed, and the process of becoming one is particularly brutal and hard even by the already horrifying standards of Space Marines.
Moving on to the rules, as the super special boys they are, the Grey Knights had a full page of special ones. They were fearless and couldn't be pinned, some could deep strike, the power-armoured ones had the True Grit ability, allowing them to wield their storm bolters as if they're a pistol and so gain the extra attack from that. Their armour offered a defence against psychic attacks, and they also had a thing called the Shrouding, which really just meant that the combined psychic nonsense around them meant that they were hard to see properly. So if you wanted to shoot at them, you needed to check if you could see them by rolling 3d6 and multiplying the result by 3, and that would be the amount of inches the Grey Knights could be spotted at. I suppose you could call those night fighting rules. I promise, if you've played 3rd edition, that's funny. There's also a couple of rules related to them and demons specifically, which, given the name of the codex, makes sense. Their very presence is nigh intolerable for demons, and so those that have to take instability tests get a -1 modifier to their leadership, and all demons charging at Grey Knights had to do so as if they were moving through difficult ground. However, since this and a bunch of other wargear Grey Knights have make them kind of overpowered versus demons, there was also the demonic infestation rule. It meant that basic demon packs, nurglings, and demonic beasts would gain the sustained attack rules in any mission where they were fighting Grey Knights. God damn it. Okay, let's go get the main rulebook out again. Okay, here we go, sustained attack. Basically, once one of the specified units was destroyed, it could come back at the table edge. It represented the fact that the Grey Knights generally only showed up for the really bad demonic incursions, but really was there to make sure that the Grey Knights didn't just stomp any army with demons in it unfairly due to all the buffs they had against them. Now, the army list.
For HQs, your selection was just a single Ordo Malleus Inquisitor Lord, who might be a Psyker and might be accompanied by an Inquisitorial henchman, which we will get into shortly, and a single Grey Knight hero, either as a Grand Master or a Brother Captain. Those Grey Knights heroes were always in Terminator armour and could take a retinue of Grey Knights Terminators. Also always a Psyker, because the old not many Psykers in the Grey Knights fluff had long since been abandoned. Elites were made up of Ordo Malleus Inquisitors, who like the Inquisitor Lords could take a henchman retinue, Grey Knight Terminators, Demon Hosts, and Assassins, and those last two require a little bit more detail. Both of them could only be included if you had at least one Inquisitor in the Force, and the Demon Hosts could be summoned into the game via Deep Strike even in missions that didn't normally allow it. They also randomly rolled for a psychic power each turn. These could be something like recovering wounds, being able to teleport, or making everyone's blood boil around them. They also prevented you from having any Grey Knights in the army, since Demon Hosts are only used by the most radical of Inquisitors, see Figure 1, and the Grey Knights want none of that business.
Assassins were available in a few forms. Death Cult Assassins were your cheap option and could be bought in units of up to 3, although they operated independently in-game. And the minis are also in the running for the most pure John Blanche any official 40k mini has ever been. There's also the 4 types of assassins we know and love: the Vindicare, the Calexis, the Calidus, and the Eversaw. These rules were more or less just the same ones they had in the 3rd edition Assassin's Codex, so if you missed out on that, well, they're in here too. They're also in Witch Hunters. For troops, you could take the basic Grey Knight squads. If a squad of Marines with Strength 6 weapons and Stormbolters who are hard to see could ever really be called basic. Although interestingly, they pulled double duty by also being the only fast attack option in the book. If taken like that, they gained the teleporting deep strike ability. Also, there's a typo in their entry, as it's actually page 8 the relevant rules are on, not page 10. Which isn't important, but would this really be a Codex compliant if we didn't point something like that out?
The other troops option was Inquisitorial Stormtroopers. They were basically just better versions of Guardsmen, having better stats, better equipment, and even being able to rock around in a Rhino if they liked. Speaking of, the dedicated transports were Chimeras, Rhinos, and Land Raiders, although the rules around them are a bit odd. So the only units in the book that can actually have the option to buy a dedicated transport are the Stormtroopers and Inquisitorial retinues, so Grey Knights can't actually use any of them as a dedicated transport at all. In fact, the Rhinos explicitly have a non-marine crew. Thankfully, it was still possible to buy Land Raiders in the normal way, as a heavy support choice, and given that this was post-Codex Armageddon, you had the option of Classic and Crusader flavours. Heavy support was rounded out by Dreadnoughts, Purgation Squads, standard Grey Knights but with more big guns, and Orbital Strikes, the latter being perfect for the person who had 60 to 80 points left over and just didn't want to have to paint any more minis. Although an interesting thing to note is that those were included so there was a representation in the army of one of the more famous Inquisitorial things, the Exterminatus. I suppose it didn't hurt that this was also an easy unit to add, as it doesn't need a new mini produced or anything.
Now, the reason that we said that this is more or less the first Grey Knights Codex earlier is that although they do represent a fairly large chunk of the list and it's entirely possible to run an army that is purely Grey Knight, it was just made clear that it probably wasn't a good idea, it was also possible to run a Daemonhunters army with 0 Grey Knights in it at all. In fact, if you wanted Demon Hosts, you kinda had to. And this kind of thing was a viable choice, not just by taking way too many Stormtroopers, but because you could use certain units from Imperial Guard and regular Space Marine armies in a Demon Hunters list, although not both at the same time. This is why there is this example of a Daemonhunters army that's mostly Crimson Fists. This also helps with the whole the only fast attack option in the book is a troop's choice with deep strike issue. You could also include a small detachment of things from this book in other Imperial armies, like this Steel Legion army with a smattering of Demon Hunter bits. This all meant that there were a lot of different ways to use this list, and also that you didn't need a full army to start using the book, since you could just attach a few squads to an existing army until they were big enough to fly solo. I am sure it will not surprise you to learn at this point that the Witch Hunters Codex had a similar thing going on. Although I will say that this did also mean that unless you know exactly how they're built, it can be a little tricky to immediately peg what's a Demon Hunters list with allies and what's an Imperial list with Demon Hunters allies just by looking at them. Which I suppose did kind of foreshadow a grimdark future full of allies, matrices and allied detachments that would follow in later editions.
There is one last bit of the main army list to bring up. The Inquisitorial retinue. These were all the freaks and geeks that could accompany an Inquisitor into battle, the amount of which varied depending on how important the Inquisitor in question was. They all started with the same basic stat line of mostly 3s, as you would expect from mostly normal humans, and came in many forms, even if they were lumped together into archetypes based on the Emperor's Tarot. Familiars, such as cherubs or servo skulls, would increase the Inquisitor's initiative and give them extra psychic powers. Hierophants, like priests or exorcists, increased their leadership and made it harder for demons to charge them, and if there were multiple Hierophants, they would also affect the demon's leadership. Acolytes could take wounds on behalf of the Inquisitor, since what else are you going to use your students for? If they have any warriors, they gained a +1 weapon skill, and the warriors could be armed either as veteran guardsmen or some form of servitor. Neither of which are remotely close to the accompanying artwork, but what are you going to do? Play witch hunters who did have a unit called Crusaders that actually match this artwork? You wouldn't dare. Taking a Sage, which was basically anyone who could be confused for a Mentat from Dune, gave the Inquisitor +1 to their ballistic skill, and finally, there's Mystics. Mystics were things like astropaths and sanctioned psychers, but instead of having some kind of power they could pop off like a regular psyker, they could instead detect demons deep striking within 46 inches of them, allowing the retinue to take a free-ranged attack at them when they appeared. If you had multiple Mystics, you could nominate another unit to take those free shots. So yeah, the henchmen were essentially 1 part meat shield, 1 part stat upgrade for the Inquisitor that happened to be separate minis in their own right, and 1 part potential kit bashing project. Which is all pretty cool, to be honest.
Then there's the psychic powers, of which there were a few. Well, 7, but getting to pick your powers at all wasn't a guaranteed thing in 3rd, so this feels pretty good. While some were general purpose, like Scourging, which was just a replacement for a shooting attack, or Holocaust, which is certainly one loaded word to describe exploding in psychic fire with a large blast template, others, like Banishment or Destroy Demon, were meant specifically to screw with demons, which of course makes sense for the faction, but made them only useful in niche applications. There's a fair amount of wargear too. A bunch of it was stuff you'll have encountered in other books, but some of note were Demon Hammers, which were just thunder hammers, but you could fight in initiative order when fighting demons rather than going last as they normally would. The Emperor's Tarot, which made you and your opponent roll off before you rolled off to see who goes first. If the dice rolls were different, you got +1 to your roll for who goes first, and if the results were the same, you got -1. Yes, there's a roll-off for the roll-off. It's not weird or clunky, shut up. The Grimoire of True Names docks the demons, and since knowing a demon's true name gives you power over them, it meant any demon in melee with a character wielding one had their weapon skill halved. And then there's Nemesis Force weapons, which were slightly bizarre. So most Grey Knights had a Nemesis Force weapon. I know the text here says they all do, but that's not, strictly speaking, true in-game. However, what a Nemesis Force weapon actually does depends on who's wielding it. They would give a blanket +2 to the user's strength, but that's all for a regular Grey Knight. If they were wielded by a Justicar, a Terminator or a Captain, they would also be a power weapon, and if it was a Grand Master holding it, it would also be a force weapon. The design notes for this codex in White Dwarf 279 hint at an earlier iteration during playtesting where they were all the same thing and they caused problems. So we get why they did this, but it does mean that a Nemesis Force weapon from this book is actually 3 different weapons in a trench coat, only one of which is actually a force weapon.
As for special named characters, there were two, Cortez and Stern. Inquisitor Lord Torquemada Cortez was only available if your Demon Hunters army was at least 1,500 points, and you couldn't have demon hosts since, like the Grey Knights, he would not tolerate such tomfoolery. He had a special anointed demon hammer that let him reroll wounds, a Glovedan eagle which gave him a +1 initiative in attack, and demons positively loathed him. And he could take a bigger retinue than normal because he's just so popular. Brother Captain Stern of the Grey Knights likewise required an army of at least 1,500 points, and was basically a better version of a Brother Captain, but his situationship with the greater demon of Sinch Macacan provided a few wrinkles. For one, the Strands of Fate rule allowed Stern to make a reroll per phase, but for every time he used it, Macacan allowed your opponent to do the same. Also, due to the Demonic Nemesis rule, if your opponent has a greater Demon of Chaos, they may upgrade it to a Lord of Change for no extra cost. Wait, what? A Lord of Change isn't an upgrade to a greater demon? You couldn't have a generic, cheaper, non-aligned demon in third to upgrade it from? Well, you couldn't, until this book. You see, because Demon Hunter armies are intended for, well, hunting demons, and demons were, at the time, just a tiny segment of Chaos armies. Chaos demons wouldn't spin off into their own books until 4th edition. That meant that they spent a few pages listing reasons why they'd be fighting the other factions that don't normally have anything to do with the Ruinous Powers. There's a lot of, oh, the enemy commander is possessed, or oh, they nicked a cursed artifact, but there are a few that are actually pretty funny. Like the ones that say things like, the Catan or Avatar of Cain are pretty demonic when you think about it, so we should probably fight them just in case. This part of the book also includes rules for adversaries, which were just narrative games that you could play where demon hunters would fight another regular army, but they were tainted by chaos, so they could take a couple of unique demonic units. One is the generic greater demon that could be upgraded to a Lord of Change if Stern was around, and the other was demon packs. Both of these units had randomly generated stats and abilities, so for example, you needed to roll to see if a greater demon had wings. On a 4+, it did. And the demon packs could have one of 3 special demonic abilities depending on what you rolled before the game. And rolling up unique demons just feels very Realm of Chaos, so we can't help but be a little bit charmed by that.
Additionally, there were a couple of new scenarios that were suitably fluffy in this book, which again feels like a bit of a throwback to the more RPG-influenced days of the game. Stop the Ritual involves, well, attempting to stop a Chaos Ritual, needing to destroy units in ritualistic circles in the centre of the board. Terminate the Demon Vessel, on the other hand, involves assaulting a stronghold of a powerful demon host, attempting to lure out and banish it. And you know a scenario isn't messing around when it requires a table to explain exactly how hard you won or lost. There's even an additional table of variations you could roll on to mix it up. Moving on to the colour section of the Codex, and it shows off a couple of the very specific quirks of the era. For one, these Grey Knights were metal minis, as the plastic ones wouldn't come out until 5th edition. So there's not that many poses for them, not that it stopped me from coveting them back in the day when they came out. In fact, most of this entire faction was metal outside of the vehicles they inherited from other factions. You also see a fair bit of the odd trend of late 3rd edition, early 4th edition, of having minis that decidedly do not have goblin green bases, but do still have a goblin green rim on them. One day I will make that video talking about how the basing styles have changed on official miniatures. It'll be really boring, but I'll love making it. Anyway, this book is far from consistent in how it shows stuff being based, going as far as having armies with inconsistent basing styles between the Inquisitorial stuff and the Allied stuff. Although I'm pretty sure the Stormtroopers in these two armies are the same minis, because I'm very normal and compared the gravel at their feet, so it looks like they repainted the rims between photos, so at least that part would match the Allied Imperial Force, so they blended together better. As an aside, isn't it fun how you can use the uneven but unique scattering of basing material, like a mini's fingerprints, to identify it specifically, even if the image is relatively small and other things have been changed? Well, I think it's fun anyway.
And here's something else fun, a couple of pages on converting. We do really miss sections like this in modern books that not only encourage converting your minis, but tell you to pilfer parts from the entire Citadel range, using minis from other factions, Necromunda, Warhammer Fantasy, and even Mordheim to represent units from this book. especially useful for making your own Inquisitorial retinues truly unique. And looking at the non-converted minis, there is something about Grey Knights using the old blue ink wash on the silver that hits a very particular nostalgic spot. Also, shout out to this Inquisitorial Rhino because they painted this one and god damn if they were going to get the most out of it. Yes, it also does show up in Witch Hunters. Also, appreciate seeing John Blanche being very John Blanche by painting his Grey Knight in the showcase red. Because he works in a very specific colour palette, and what kind of a monster would you be if you made him go outside of that?
So, what do we make of Codex Daemonhunters? Well, it's certainly got some powerful and flavourful things going on. Having one of your basic troops choices being Marines with Strength 6 weapons and Stormbolters that you might not be able to see was a lot at the time. And their lack of transport options was made up for a little by some of them being able to deep strike. Plus you had things like the ability to customise your Inquisitorial retinues or use units as part of other armies or vice versa, which gave you some freedom in how you built a force, whilst feeling very fluffy. But being so specialised to kill demons came at the cost of small model counts, so you were going to be outnumbered pretty much all the time. There's also the small fact that a bunch of their rules were not really relevant against things that weren't demons. And again, this is before demons spun off into their own factions, so they were quite a small part of the game. And when they were fighting an army that didn't have demons in it, well, they weren't that great at taking down vehicles. And that's not even getting into the odd stuff like Nemesis Force weapons only being Force weapons 33% of the time.
But Daemonhunters were always going to be a bit odd. The Inquisition is one of those factions where most of what they do in-universe is off the battlefield, and getting even just one of the Ordo of them into a playable faction was always going to be a little awkward. Plus, I'm sure many would say that that awkwardness gives the Daemonhunters more flavour than just a book of generic Space Marines would have, and we can't exactly argue there, since we agree. By the next Daemonhunters Codex in 5th edition, the Grey Knights would get the headline slot, along with a more fleshed out roster and little things like Rhinos Marines could actually use. We remember this being a particularly strong book, but that is very much a discussion for another time. One that we do want to have, if for no other reason than because the term Cyphelman Dreadnought is amusing, and we'd get a chance to use it. Still, despite having some rough edges and dubious utility in many tabletop applications, it's hard to not kind of like Codex Daemonhunters.
Although that fondness may be largely influenced by the fact that in 2026 we wouldn't need to buy an entire army of metal Space Marines that cost twice as much as the plastic ones to actually play with it. Sometimes a small model count can be a blessing.
Also, be proud of us, we did this whole thing and didn't make a single K-pop Daemonhunters joke. But we wanted to.
Hello there, thank you for watching, hope you liked it. If you did, then please consider making that like official by hitting the like button. It is legally binding. Or maybe leaving a comment telling us about your experiences with the book. You could even subscribe if you're feeling really cheeky. And if you'd like to help make more of these videos, in a financial way, then head over to patreon.com/snipeandwib, where, as well as making it possible for us to spend the time making these, you'll get early access to videos, exclusive content, and your names listed in the credits like all these lovely folk you see before you. Okay, now on to the important stuff, the end credits question for you to answer in the comments to confuse everyone who didn't listen this far. Who's your favourite Ninja Turtle? I think both Snipe and I would go for Raphael, although as a kid I liked Leonardo the best. God, now I just kind of want to go back and watch Rise of the TMNT again. That was a fun show. Anyway, take care of each other, and we'll see you next time.